Hello, friends. This is Jean Miele. I'm going to do a short screencast video to review Lightroom workflow for RAW files. We're going to take a look at an image that I shot recently on a lovely, lovely road trip to Colorado. The drive from Santa Fe up to Carbondale in the Rockies was just tremendous. I shot a lot of new work. I was lucky enough to have extremely dramatic weather and the luxury of time to take that trip by myself. But we're going to focus on one image in particular. I'm going to assume that you have already imported and renamed your files. You've already done your selection and that you're down to a single raw file. So here we are in the develop module. And I just want to quickly review my recommended order of workflow. So there's housekeeping that needs to be done first. That is heading down to the lens corrections module in order to turn on the checkbox that says remove chromatic aberration. And you can choose optionally whether or not you want to correct for the optical imperfections of the lens by enabling profile corrections. In this case, I will. Other basic housekeeping involves selecting a camera profile. And so what I recommend is that you go through the entire list and compare. Generally, anytime you have a menu like this, reviewing and then narrowing down to a couple of choices, in this case, I would choose landscape, is a great idea. But don't forget that this little box over here opens up a whole world of presets, black and white, color, artistic, etc., etc. In this case, we're going to keep this image in color and proceed. So I've selected the landscape profile. That's like choosing a type of film if you were shooting film in a camera. Another basic choice we're making at the beginning, because we're going from big choices to small, is we're going to choose what the color of the image might be. And so we could go through this preset menu and see if it suggests anything to us, because we're always playing a game of what if. And again, I'm always sort of comparing better or worse, better or worse. And another option here is you can always use this little targeted adjustment tool. And what that will do is it'll make wherever you click gray. So if I click on this bright orange, it's trying to add a lot of blue to neutralize the orange. In this case, I'm looking for sort of a fairly neutral cloud and deciding whether or not I like that better than the auto preset or as shot. And in this case, I kind of do. Remember, you can always hit the Y key for a before and after, and that gives you a point of comparison. You can always hit the tab key to make the modules on the left and right disappear. And in this case, I think I like the emphasis on the color. And so I hit the Y key again to get out of the comparison mode. Again, we're moving from big moves to small moves. You can crop at any time, especially if you're working on a raw file. And I don't necessarily want to crop this, but I might use this little targeted adjustment angle tool to straighten out the horizon here. And that looks a little better. If I go back in the history to before I cropped, I will remind you that, especially if you're shooting architecture, what you can also do is use this transform module to correct perspective. And in this case, there we go, off level. It's not really finding its way, but if there's really sort of clear geometry, then that's a great choice. And this also has a targeted adjustment tool. And so this is very similar to the thing that we use to level the horizon, although you need to add 2 points. And so if we have a building or something like that, we can use this to straighten things out, and you can add multiple points like this. So I think what I'll do is I'll just go back to the crop tool, grab this targeted adjustment angle tool, know that that's exactly what I want to do. And so here's our before and after so far. We're just doing the big stuff now. Once we have done our lens corrections, done any cropping or transformation, chosen a camera profile and selected our color. And of course, we can always play with this to make things warmer or cooler, to give us ideas, anything like that. Once we've done those big things, what I can do is I can move on to the basic panel. We could set a black point and then do the shadows, and then the white point and then do the highlights. But generally what I prefer to do is to play with the presence sliders before we do that. The reason that I recommend this is because if we add or subtract dehaze, what it does, and this is true of clarity and texture as well, what it does is it changes the contrast. It changes everything. And so if I set a black point and then later add my presence adjustments, then that black point or white point becomes a moving target. And so generally, I wouldn't recommend going too far. You know, things get a little wonky. But in this case, adding a bunch of dehaze really helps this image come to life. And what I generally recommend is zooming in to make sure nothing bad is happening. You can zoom back out, zooming in and out as you go to check your work. But look at the image, not the numbers on the slider. Make your decisions visually based on whether you like the way the picture looks. And so adding a bit of clarity and a bit of dehaze to this particular image doesn't seem to be creating any bad edges where dark areas meet light areas, and it's certainly enhancing the image. Another way that we can preview the before and after is to hit the backslash key on the right side of the keyboard in between the delete key and the return key. And instead of showing us the side-by-side before and after that the Y key shows us, it shows us an overlay. And we want to constantly be comparing to see if what we're doing is making the picture better or worse. Counterintuitively, what I will often do if I'm adding clarity is I will decrease texture. And the reason I do that is because clarity, dehaze, texture, they all tend to emphasize noise or grain or texture. And so adding that clarity and dehaze, but dialing the texture down a little bit is a way for us to moderate the amount of noise that's being introduced to the image. Of course, you can also always go down to the detail panel where we find sharpening and use a moderate amount of noise reduction. The problem with noise reduction is, in addition to reducing noise, it also reduces detail. And we want to be careful not to lose important detail in our search for smoothness. Don't want things to be soft. So here's the before and after so far. What we've done is we've done sort of big moves and then added presence. And this could also be a nice time to play with vibrance or saturation. And that could look very nice with sort of a de-emphasis on the color. Of course, it depends on your style. So let yourself be guided by your own feelings. And you might notice also that if I try something and I want to reset it, I double click on the word in that slider and it resets it completely. If I want to reset an entire panel, I can hold the Option key. And when I hold the Option key, you'll notice that in many, many places, it offers us a reset option for a set of tones. So I could reset the presence, for example, by Option clicking and then clicking where it says reset presence. In this case, I'm going to undo that so I can retain the adjustments I've done so far. Once I've done the lens correction, and I've done the cropping or straightening, and I've chosen a profile, and I've played with the color, and I have done the presence and maybe played with vibrance and saturation, then I'm ready to set a black point. There are many ways to do this. There are almost always 3 ways to do something in every Adobe product. My favorite is to hold the Shift key and double click on the word blacks. And what it does is it finds the darkest pixel and it maps it to a value of 0. So we're making sure that we have real black. The problem with not having a full histogram, that is reducing black, is even though things seem more open, what it's doing is it's leaving a space on the end of the histogram. It means that there is no black in the picture. And when we go to print, that means that there's no chance that there's going to be any real black in the print. We're endeavoring in 99% of cases to introduce a full range of tones to the picture that is real black and real white, mapping that histogram left to right, 0 to 255, in order to be able to make a beautiful print, but also in order to introduce dimensionality into the picture. What you'll notice is when you have a real black and a real white, the picture looks much, much more clear, much more 3D. So I have set my black point, and before I move on to white, I'm going to open up the shadows or just play with the shadows slider to see what I like. And what you'll see is that it moves the histogram to the right, but it doesn't move that black point off that left side. It doesn't prevent us from having a full black. Similarly, I will shift double click on the word whites, and that will find the lightest pixel and map that to 255. So now our histogram is spread out, but things are getting a little hot. So what we do in parallel to what we did with the blacks and the shadows, we work the whites and the highlights. Now, if I reduce the highlights all the way, that doesn't really bring me back to where I want to be. So what I might do is I might manually reduce the whites to a place where these rocks, for example, look great, and then increase the highlights. In this case, I don't like what's happening with the rocks. And so I'm going to develop just for the rocks. I'm not going to have a full tonal range, but I'm doing this knowing that when I get to the point where I'm going to introduce masks or local adjustments, that I will introduce more white into the area where I want people to look. And that's probably going to be somewhere down here in the middle. So the histogram is looking better, not perfect. If you're familiar with tone curves, you might play with that to see, oh, interesting. So what I'm seeing is the sky gets much more dramatic when I get things a little bit darker. And I might just make note of that for later when I do local adjustments. I'm going to restore this back to its default, sort of readjust my white point and my highlights for the foreground, and make a little note that there are sort of 2 modes for the tone curve. One gives you these sliders. My preference is to work with the tone curve more the way it looks in Photoshop. And so I click on this little gray circle, and that allows me to introduce my own points to the curve. So I can play what if it was lighter? Would I like to open up the shadows in the foreground? What if it's darker? Would I like to make the sky more dramatic? And again, there's no overall adjustment here that helps every part of the picture. So I'm making notes in my mind that I'd like to make the sky darker. And I'd also like to increase the amount of white in the area where I'd like people to look, thereby creating a full tonal range where I want to direct the viewer's attention. You might have noticed that I haven't used the exposure slider or the contrast slider. You can play with these at any time. And in this case, maybe a slight increase in contrast would help the whole image overall. I tend to avoid the exposure slider unless there's a really, really big adjustment to be made. If you think of this whole thing as a toolbox, I tend to think of the exposure slider as a sledgehammer. And in this case, there's really kind of no sledgehammer work that needs to be done to this image. So let's pause. And again, take a look at our before and after. I'll hit the Y key and the tab key. And that's really getting somewhere. When we shoot and we look at the image on the back of the camera, even when it's perfectly exposed, it looks great on the camera, but even when we get it on the computer, it also generally looks great. But now what we're seeing is that our eyes are compensating for that flatness. We're sort of seeing what we want to see. I was very happy with this picture on the back of the camera and happy with it when I looked at it after import in Lightroom. But as you can see, step by step, as we make improvement after improvement, it gets more and more dramatic. Again, I'll try the backslash key. And you can see that it looks much more dimensional, much more dramatic. There's much more detail in every area of the picture, except the shadows. We don't always need to open up the shadows a lot. In fact, that can work against us because open shadows, deep shadows create drama. So again, I hit the tab key and get my tools back, and I'm working from bigger to smaller. So let's take a look at what else I might do. HSL color, color grading, these are sort of optional in terms of non-linear adjustment of color. What that means is you could change the blue in a different way that you change the yellow. And for this image, I don't think we need anything. It's always a good idea to check whether we want a vignette. And what I'll show you is if we make a really heavy vignette and turn the feathering down, that vignette is just a big dark circle. Of course, we could change the shape of it. It doesn't have to be a circle. It could be an oval. It could be almost a square. We can move that circle in or out. And so let me reset this. I'm going to hold the Option key, reset the vignetting. I add a little bit of vignetting. I play with whether I want to move it in or out. And oftentimes what I'll do is I will increase the feathering so that it's more subtle. In addition to using the backslash or the Y key for our before and after, another way that we can always check our work is each of these panels has a little switch. And if I turn the switch off, it turns off the effect of that panel. So I can see that this vignette is a little too heavy. I'll dial it back a little bit. Before, after. I'm just driving attention into the center of the picture with this vignette. Another way I can check my work is to go into the history and use the before and after. When I'm working with this Y key before and after as a default, it shows me the very, very first history state. I can change what the before is by right-clicking inside the history on any particular stage. And that point will become this before picture. We do not want to click in the picture because that actually changes where we're working. It changes the history state. Instead, on a Mac, I can control click. On a PC, you can right click. And I could say, well, how did this look before I added a vignette? So I right click, and the menu item is copy history step settings to before. What that really means is make this step in the history the before. Again, notice I did not click, I right clicked, I accessed the menu item. And now if I hit the tab key to make the sides disappear, the only difference I'm seeing is that vignette. And that'll also be reflected if I hit the backslash key. It's a really, really great practice to take advantage of changing the history state so you can decide whether it's better or worse 1 step before, 5 steps before, 20 steps before. So by right-clicking in the history and going back to before I added any black, making that the before, I can check that out and see that it's much more dimensional, much more alive. I can always return the before state all the way back to the import by right-clicking at the bottom. Again, I'm not clicking. And so this is my overall before and after, but you can take advantage of this ability to change the before state just to check whether 1 step or 5 steps is better or worse. Where can we go? You'll notice I have not reached for any of these masks, these local adjustments. The reason is if I start doing small adjustments before I've finished all my overall adjustments, I'll introduce some local adjustment, and then I'll do a big adjustment, and the local adjustment will change, and it's a moving target. I highly recommend doing everything you can possibly do on the picture overall before reaching for the local adjustments. So the question I'm asking at this point is, have I done everything I can do to this picture overall? And let me just review. I don't think there's anything that needs to be retouched. I'm not going to change the HSL color. Is there anything I want to revisit? Do I want to check whether I've done too much dehaze? Again, I'm not looking at the slider, I'm looking at the picture. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to go back in the history and see. I've changed it to 52. Where was I before? I was at 51. So I'm making decisions by eye. This looks pretty good. Certainly, it's a really good before and after. And I think perhaps I'm ready to do some local adjustments. So it's tempting to select the sky in this case, or with another image to select the background or the subject. But thinking back to the way that we did our work in a traditional darkroom, what I highly recommend is that if you can do your work using big, soft adjustments rather than specific cutouts, you should. There are a couple of reasons for this. One reason is that the work will be less obvious. Another reason is, for instance, with the sky, generally speaking, if we select the sky and we do an adjustment, it's going to adjust the sky uniformly. And the sky is not generally a uniform place visually. It's almost always lighter at the bottom and darker at the top. And so a linear gradient is probably a better choice. So I'm going to just go back in my history I'm going to select a linear gradient, and you'll see that it opens up this new mask panel. I'm going to click and drag. And what happens is if I hold the shift key, it'll stay at 90 degrees rather than being a little bit tilty. So I'm not starting at the top of the image, and I'm not worrying about overlapping the mountains a bit. And what you'll see is that this overlay shows the area that's going to be affected. I had a leftover setting here in exposure, and I'm going to turn that back to 0. All my sliders are at 0. And so now I can play this game of what if. What if I darken down the sky? Well, that's great, and that certainly drives the attention in. But again, exposure is kind of a sledgehammer. And so unless I want to be really, really dramatic, I'm going to keep that moderate. Another way to mitigate the drama of the exposure slider is to highlight the numbers and then use the up and down arrow keys in order to make very, very fine adjustments. And so if I'm going to add any exposure to this, it's going to be a little tiny bit. More likely, what I might do is see if a little bit more blue in the sky did anything, or see if I want to warm it up. And I don't think so. I could play with all the sliders that mimic the basic panel. And generally, what I'm doing here is just playing this game of what if to see if I like this. Similar to the switches in the panels, we have an eyeball here on the mask, and I could turn it on and off. You notice that I'm sort of toning the white down in the clouds. And that's because I want to drive the attention to the horizon. And so I like that. I could consider adding even more dehaze, but that's going to be crazy. We can move this entire adjustment to see what happens. The closer together these lines are, the more dramatic a line it's going to create, undo. And the further apart these are, the more feathered and the more gradual and more subtle that adjustment is going to be. So what I'm doing here with this mask is I'm just toning down the top of the sky. And if I double click on the word mask 1, I could say tone down the sky. I can label each mask so that I know exactly what it is. If I want to add an additional mask, that is another local adjustment, I click on create new mask. And in this case, I'll select a radial gradient. And just generally, you know what, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to reset exposure to 0. And now when I get the radial gradient, there isn't any pre-adjusted setting in there. I just want to kind of drive attention to the center. And so this overlay is showing me right where the middle is. And now if I increase highlights, or if I increase the whites in there a little bit, or maybe even, no, exposure's too much, I could increase contrast. And again, I can check before, after, before, after. This is much clearer. It's much more dramatic, and I can change the shape of this. I could also change the feathering, make it less feathered or more feathered if I want, and check my work. So it's not intensely dramatic. I just want to drive attention into that center part of the picture. And you could do that visually. So let's go back in the history to before we did any local adjustments. So here's where we did the linear gradient. I'll go one step before that, right click, make this the before, that is copy history step settings to before, and then hit the / key. Oh, I'm wrong. I have to go a little further back. Here's where the first linear gradient was. Let me go right before that. Make that the before, after. I'm going to hit the return key to make that disappear. Before, after. So the top of the sky before is brighter and the horizon is duller. After, the top of the sky is less interesting and the center is more interesting. Although I'm also noticing when I check my work that that radial gradient is creating an undesired effect on the rocks in the foreground. You know, I want more contrast and more white at the horizon, but I don't want that over here. So in order to readjust, I open up the mask panel, I make this mask active, the pins show again, and I can click on this to get these two buttons that say add or subtract. If I want to subtract from this adjustment, I click on subtract and I have the choice of using any of these local adjustment tools, any of these masking tools to take away from the existing adjustment. So if I click on the brush and I turn off auto mask and I make sure the flow is high and I adjust the size to what I want it to be, I can also use the square bracket keys to the right of the P key to make it smaller, that is the left bracket, or bigger, that is the right bracket. Oops, undo. And now if I use this brush, what's happening is I'm using the brush to subtract from that radial gradient. And you'll see that the brush is here. And if I turn on the overlay, you'll see there's no longer orange on this part of the image. You'll also see if I hit the backslash key, if I turn off the overlay, that the horizon's being affected, but this area no longer is. Another important thing to know when you're working with the masks is when we make a mask active and we see the pin and the overlay for either one of these, the default mode is to always show these pins. What I recommend and what I prefer is changing that always to auto. Everywhere that's a possibility. And what that means is when you mouse out of the picture with those pins active, they disappear. And when you mouse in, they reappear. So without getting too crazy and making this too long, I'm going to say we're in a pretty good place to stop. Here is our overall, returning this to the before. Here's our overall before and after. Here's the overall before, overall after. What's important to remember is that it doesn't matter whether your picture is a landscape or a still life or a picture of a person. Going through this procedure, starting from big, starting from housekeeping, and moving towards medium-sized and then specific adjustments is always going to lead you to a dramatic transformation. The transformation isn't the result of a single choice or a few big moves. It's the result of a lot of little good choices. And in this case, I think this looks really quite nice. So thanks for your attention. I hope this is helpful.